Hello and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick, with the City of Hampton's Communications and Marketing Department. And today we're going to talk about one of Hampton's many firsts. And it's one that I don't think as many people know, maybe, as they could. My guests today, I have two Mikes from the Hampton History Museum, Mike Cobb and Mike McGran. Thank you for coming.
Good to be here.
And so we're going to talk about Hampton being the first, I'll probably get all the details wrong, recorded English Christmas in the New World? Recorded Christmas in the New World?
Robin, it certainly is, and it's really quite a story. And it starts in our very, very beginnings in the 17th century when the Virginia Company of London sent settlers here to what is now Virginia. They were looking for gold and silver and a shortcut to China.
That's right.
And I got to tell you, I live in Williamsburg, and not only is there not a shortcut to China, there's not a shortcut to Williamsburg up this peninsula. So they were sorely disappointed. And in the first years, they had a hard time. And most people who came here died. People were dying off very quickly from disease, from starvation, and other issues. So it was very, very tough. And as you know, the English came here into the bay, and they eventually established a permanent settlement at Jamestown. Mm-hmm. And their stalwart soldier and leader was Captain John Smith, not very popular among the other colonists. Many of them were gentlemen and others who disliked him. And
he was what, you have to work for your food, right?
Had to work for your food, the idea of working, yes. And so Captain John Smith actually saved the colony. And because he was a soldier, he was used to the elements, he was chosen to be the fellow who goes out and finds food. And they found that gold and silver is very nice, but if you don't have food, it's very difficult. So John Smith is a Cape merchant, and he, with others, get in a small boat and they go up and down the bay. And
so what year is this we're talking?
Well, from 1607 roughly to around 1608,
okay.
he's doing this.
So really right at the very beginning.
And in these experiences, like in all his travels in Turkey and other places, he gets to know the people who live on the land. And he becomes accustomed to the Indians' traditions and the way of life. And that really saves Virginia. He learns how to disperse the colony. And one of the first, actually the first occupation of what today is Hampton, is when John Smith brought a small group of Englishmen from Jamestown down to Point Comfort, because he knew if they all stayed together, 100+ men and boys, that they had to compete for food. But by splitting them up in small groups, they could live off the land, as the Indians did. So the first occupation here is actually very, very early. And in 1608, and these group of men come here and they fish and they survive. Also about that same time, and actually in the winter, when things were very, very bad, Smith and company were in their small boat, a shallop, and they were cruising the coast in search for food. And they pulled in on a very fateful evening into the village of Kecoughtan. Kecoughtan was the Indian village that was probably where the VA hospital is today.
Okay.
And it's where Pochins was the head man. Pochins was Powhatan's son and the half-brother of Pocahontas. Mm-hmm. So Smith and company land. The Indians greet them. And it's a terrible night. Can you imagine how and you're freezing and snow and such, and suddenly you're in a warm place.
Yeah, and I don't go out on my kayak in that weather, right? You know.
No, and he goes in one of these very warm lodges made of reeds and saplings, and a fire is going, and the Indians are all gathered around, and they feast on oysters and deer meat and others, and everything is quite merry. And John Smith would later write, "I was never better entertained than in the warm, dry, smoky houses of Kecoughtan." And he immortalizes this, and of course this is in the Christmas season. And here he is, really grateful for the things that are really important to us. Mm-hmm. And those are the basic things, friendship and food and exactly. And in this very primeval setting, John Smith celebrates this time at this Christmas season, which we still celebrate. And so it's very, very, very important time. John Smith is later unfortunately injured in a gunpowder accident and sent back to England, but John Smith saves the colony. And I want to tell you something that's not very well known about John Smith and Hampton, is right before he was injured, the Virginia Company wanted to put him in charge of the post at Kecoughtan, which is now Hampton. And so if he had not been hurt,
wow,
history would have changed very drastically. But
we'd have had that very dynamic leader here in Hampton.
Exactly. And we did to an extent, but he would have been associated more closely with Hampton. It's also interesting that the word Kecoughtan, going back to the ancient Indian name, still is here. We have a high school on a road named Kecoughtan, so those ancient words are still with us.
I lived on Powhatan Parkway forever, and of course you have Pochin and Pocahontas, all those streets nearby, Okanoo, all named for the Kecoughtan Indians.
Our history is about us everywhere we look and everywhere we dig, very, very importantly. And of course, through the century, John Smith shapes the direction. They do not find gold and silver, but fortunately in 1619, John Rolfe, who marries Pocahontas, discovers a sweet-tasting strain of tobacco. Now, tobacco wasn't new. The Indians had it, the Spanish had it. It was in Europe. But he found a very pleasing type. It became the rage of Europe. In fact, if you dig in Virginia now, what you're going to find most commonly is tobacco, clay tobacco pipes. That's how prevalent it was.
Oh, any dig turns those up.
Exactly. In order to get the tobacco to England to sell it, we needed a port and a town. The town of Hampton was established in 1691, and in the Act of Towns and Ports. And we built a town laid out in two streets, King Street and Queen Street, and where there were houses and warehouses and apothecaries and taverns and such. Then the port itself was laid out with the wharf, and ships from all over the English Empire came here to take tobacco back to England, and also to bring manufactured goods back to Hampton. So in the 17th century, the foundations of Hampton are shaped. Captain John Smith has a large hand in that. Thankfully, tobacco comes along, becomes the great cash crop, and it leads to building the town of Hampton and the port of Hampton. So the 17th century is our genesis of this place we now call Hampton.
That is so interesting. Now tell me, why do you think it isn't terribly well known that this was the first Christmas or English Christmas celebrated
because
here?
we're overshadowed, Robin, by the fact that we're downriver from Jamestown.
Exactly.
And Jamestown was the main settlement.
We were just an outpost.
We were just an outpost, and for many, many decades, you've had the interpretation of Jamestown. The Jamestown settlement opened in 1957 to commemorate the founding of Jamestown, and also the actual site of Jamestown. Jamestown Island, which the National Park Service and the APVA operate. So you've had a lot of scholarly attention to that part of our history, and also very importantly, you have the recreated fort, the recreated Indian village, and then you have the archaeological dig, the ongoing archaeological dig, where Bill Kelso and his associates are doing great things, uncovering historic Jamestown. And at the same time, it's really living in a great time. At the very same time this is happening, Powhatans, the great Powhatan, the Indian leaders, his settlement is found up in Gloucester County.
Oh, I know, wasn't that great?
And that's being excavated, so you see both sides of the world that existed in the 17th century, plus the coming of Africans here. That is also, we're learning more and more about that. And of course, that begins here at Old Point Comfort or Hampton. That story starts to unfold. Yeah,
not necessarily an illustrious beginning. When you are bringing the first Africans in, when you're establishing tobacco as your economic base, all these things had not pleasant, but it was part of our history. You know,
very sorrowful.
And you learn from it, and you don't forget it. But it is sometimes a little painful to dissect that. And our relationship with the Native Americans went downhill pretty quickly after Captain John Smith, I assume.
It did, and actually, unfortunately, during his time. In fact, there was a pitched battle fought between John Smith and the Indians. These relationships went back and forth. At times, they were good. For instance, at the time that John Smith on that Christmas season came into Hampton, and many other times too. But when the Indians, for whatever reason, did not want to negotiate for food, sometimes there was violence, and that also became a pattern that was carried on. In fact, by 1610, the Indians are attacked here, and the Indians are removed, and two forts are built, Fort Henry and Charles. and that becomes sort of the nucleus for what will become the settlement of Hampton.
Okay, but getting back to that Christmas moment.
Yes.
Let's just talk just for a second about what that was like, because obviously you said these are starving people, these are people who don't have a whole lot going on. It's not like our Christmas today where we go to parades and spend money at the mall and have lavish decorations. I mean, Christmas was not even just for them, but it was simpler then anyway.
Very much so, and these were desperate, desperate men, and we also have to think that they're in a new world. They're in a place, they come from England, which is very crowded, most of the trees are gone, and they come to these vast forests and these great oceans and waterways, this boundless land full of game and deer and such. And also the seas are full of oysters and crabs and fish. It was an Eden to them. In fact, in their descriptions, they tell us that. They tell us what a wonderful place it was, and they are just so overwhelmed by the freedom here. What it was like in that lodge, we can only imagine, but just think about it. Think of these people gathered together. Think about them being so desperate and so far from home, and suddenly in a very comforting place, and having this evening on the dry, smoky houses of Kecoughtan must have been a time that they remembered very well.
And we know about this because, I mean, what's the historical evidence
We
for
know
this?
because Captain John Smith was not only a soldier and a man of the world, he was a writer and a map maker. He wrote many volumes, and also William Strachey and George Percy wrote of their times here. They were great anthropologists, really, and they described the Virginia Indians, what they looked like, how they lived, and also what the land was like. In fact, where downtown Hampton was, a lot of that land had been cleared. And they had planted fields there of corn and squash and pumpkins, and they had their lodges, which they'd move every once in a while. And so we know a lot about the Virginia Indians and about the national attributes here from the writings of the English early chroniclers.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. And we're going to talk a little bit later about some events that the History Museum does every year to celebrate this and help people know more about that first Christmas.
So much to talk about.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Robin.
And thank you for watching. I hope during this holiday season, for those of you who celebrate Christmas, you might take a moment while your family and friends are gathered around your fireplace or wherever you gather and think about how those early settlers and those Native Americans celebrated and marked the holiday in a very different time. Thank you.